Welcome to the Gottesdienst Crowd, where we foster confessional integrity, liturgical preservation, and preaching that doesn't stink. We believe that the historic liturgy of the divine service is more than mere cobwebs of antiquity, but it is a true treasure of the Church, to be dusted off and brought down from her attic to be enjoyed. So let's get dusting. Welcome back to the Gottesdienst Crowd. This is Jason Broughton, your host, coming from Tuscola, Illinois. Today, we are talking about, that's right, the office. The office of the Holy Ministry. And we're going to use as our guide, St. Paul, his statement in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, which reads, "This is how one should regard us, as servants of Christ and stewards of the mystery of God, that primarily others, and thus ourselves, should regard the office and what we do in liturgical terms." So with us to talk about that today is Fritz Eckardt, the editor-in-chief of the Gottesdienst Journal. Welcome back, Fritz.
Thanks. Good to be back.
And also, Karl Fabrizius. He's the pastor of Our Father Lutheran Church in Greenfield, Wisconsin. And he has two columns recurring in the journal, one musing on the mysteries and the other musing on hymns. Welcome back, Karl.
Thanks.
So, St. Paul says that we should regard those who are in the pastoral office as servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. What does it mean, Fritz, to be a servant of Christ?
Well, that term, I believe, is used for servants or emissaries of royalty, of kings, of important people. So, in fact, there's another word for slaves. It's not really that at all. It's ambassadors. It's a very high thing to be a servant of Christ, because, in fact, that's word is full of baggage. Really, it has to do with the fact that Christ is himself the incarnate God, and he bequeaths to his servants the very office that he himself inhabited when he became flesh. So we carry out not only the duties that Christ gives us to do, but embody them in a mysterious kind of a way. I'll lead with that.
Is that like the in persona Christi that we hear about?
Yeah, in the person of Christ. So I would say it's more than simply just being like a mail carrier or something. It's more organic than that. This goes to why, for example, ministers, according to St. Paul, must be men. It's not just a idle jumping through the hoop type thing. It's because of the incarnation of Christ as a male, which is why also in Acts chapter 1, that was one of the stipulations for the replacement for Judas, for example. The office of Christ is the office of the person, the people, the men who serve as his living icons, so to speak, his living images. After all, it's not right that we would have worship, as a lot of people I'm sure do somewhere, just by tuning into the internet and listening to recordings of sermons. I mean, some people are reduced to having to do that, but that's far less than the ideal, because true worship has to do with being in the presence of the incarnate one. And we encounter him. I hate to use that word, but there's a salutary use of that word in his word and in his sacraments. And the way we encounter him and in his word is by listening to the men who preach it out of their mouths. Jesus opened his mouth and taught them in the Sermon on the Mount. And then you have in the book of Acts, I think it's Stephen and perhaps also Peter, opened their mouth. There's a very strong connection between the opening of their mouths and the opening of his mouth. There's a tie. There's a continuation, if you will, of his incarnation in the office that they hold. That's not to say that the ministers or the apostles are themselves the incarnate one. Of course not. But they do bear in their body the marks of Christ, as Paul says.
Well, and I've even added to that and said, it's much like Christ is the sun of righteousness, and Peter, in a sense, is the moon, and so are those who preach the stars. You have this sort of connection in which the lesser lights draw all their light, though, from that which is the greatest light. And so to have this, it's very incarnational and tied into the created images as well. The idea that there is this need for the gospel to be spoken by one who is a male and also who is a physical being, not just some kind of, like, as he said, you listen to the radio, or even watching TV really isn't the same thing as putting your butt in the pew, so to speak, and you have a total incarnational experience in the body of Christ. You're doing all these things within the corporate worship. You have the man who's preaching, you have the hearers in the pews. It's very much a sort of part of the resurrection as well. You're recognizing that it involves your bodily life as well as just some kind of spirituality.
So we should regard this servants of Christ not as our service primarily to Christ, but our service on behalf of Christ or in his stead.
Yeah. It only goes one way. We are servants. He doesn't need to be served. He needs only in this respect, that he chooses, he deigns to have it done this way, that his will is carried out. The delivery of his word is carried out by those whom he sends. The apostolic ministry is the ministry of those whom he sends. You know, when he, in the last chapter of Matthew, says, go and teach all nations, that command is not given to every individual Christian. It's given to the apostles. It's given to the 12. Even the Virgin Mary wasn't there. All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Therefore, you go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them. He's telling this to the 12 that are assembled there, and he's conferring upon them the very authority and power that he himself gained from the Father.
I do like that older translation that you even made mention of, that we're ambassadors of Christ. You know, when Jesus talks about serving and being served, that is the other word. And you have a striking difference here. And then Paul goes on here and makes that point that he's not judged by men, but by the God who called him and sent him out to proclaim this word, so that the word itself becomes the key issue associated with the office.
Yeah, so are we to take as servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God as separate things, or as things explaining one another, kind of like as in a positive?
Yeah, it's clearly the latter. That and is as if to say, namely, The fancy word for it is epexegetical, but nobody knows what that means.
Right.
Steward.
Well, that's why I didn't use it, Fritz.
Ministers of Christ. Well, I just like to show off every once in a while. Every once in a while, I know a word. Ministers of Christ, and that is to say, namely, stewards of the mysteries of God. And the word mysteries, I don't have the Latin in front of me, but I think that the Latin translation of that is sacramenta.
Yeah.
Which is, of course, a reference not only to the sacraments as we know them, but certainly includes them. The gifts of God are mysterious. That's why we officially call baptism and the supper sacraments. But the word is wider than that. There's something very mysterious going on in the way in which God reaches us. He comes to us through means. But the means by which he comes to us also come to us through means. And the means through which they come to us are the ministers, the stewards. The same word, incidentally, for the steward of the landowner in the parable of there's 2-3 parables where Jesus uses the word stewards. Mm-hmm. So we're just kind of the underlings doing what the landowner himself is doing. I think of one thing I learned a long time ago. There is an account in Matthew's Gospel, which is, of course, much more Jewish, of the centurion's servant who goes to Jesus and says that his servant is sick at home. And there's no need for you to come because I have people under me and one says this and the other says that. And Jesus is amazed at his faith. If you look at that same account in I think it's Luke's Gospel, which is far less Hebrew or Hebraistic, the detail is that, in fact, the centurion sent servants to inquire, to ask Jesus if he would heal his servant. Whereas in Matthew's Gospel, it appears as though he goes himself. And the reason for that disparity or difference is that, as far as Matthew's concerned, the sending of a servant, such as actually took place, according to Luke, is identical to the to the coming of the individual himself. We have this encased in our small catechism in the 5th chief part. I believe that when the called ministers of Christ deal with us by his command, it is as valid and certain as if Christ, our dear Lord, dealt with us himself.
And that really is the point, isn't it? That what happens liturgically in the divine service is that it is not Fritz or Jason or Karl who is preaching and baptizing and administering the Lord's Supper and absolving, but it is Christ himself.
Yes, and in fact, even to go back to this whole steward idea, Jesus has that language of he goes away and entrusts his house to the steward. And the steward is to care for the house until his return. And then the steward is judged by his master according to his faithfulness. All that relates well to Paul's language here when he's talking about stewards of the mysteries. And he's just gotten done with that language about Peter and Apollos and that whole question when really they're all giving Christ because they are all these ambassadors, the ones who bear Christ in their bodies, so that their mouths, while they're all different individuals, I mean, you, Jason, are a much nicer person than I am. So, people look at you and go, hey, that Jason's a nice guy. Then they meet me and they go, But we both bear the same gospel and proclaim the same gospel. And so we are these ambassadors. We're simply watching over the household until we get replaced or Christ comes again.
So when we think of our pastors or when we think of ourselves, we should see ourselves as always those who are in the stead and by the command of Christ. And that anything that we do that goes outside of that, we should consider, we should take a second glance at whether we should do that or not, right? That if we are going to, on Sunday morning or at the bedside of one of our parishioners, be or do or say something that is outside of Christ's command or institution, that should give us pause, should it not?
Absolutely. It's a scary thing. It's a frightful thing. I don't think there's anyone who really has greater reason to feel guilty than a minister, even though there are those who, at least according to the way they behave, don't seem to have a worry in the world about whether or not they're offending God. It's a terrifying thing to think of whether or not you're worthy. I mean, I know I'm not. That's the problem. I love the vesting prayers that were given. There's one that Luther wrote. There's actually a couple of them. And then there's some more traditional ones, which are helpful because they're prayed before you go in to conduct the ceremonies of the divine service while putting your vestments on. And it is an implicit reminder of why the pastor wears vestments. He is not in his own person. He's in the person of Christ. There's another analogy that, in fact, Paul himself makes, and it's in this same chapter. As I note reading further, he says to the Corinthians that he has begotten them through the gospel. And then he says that Timothy is his beloved son. And he also says something about it's good that you don't have many fathers. This is a kind of a controverted issue in our midst, but I don't think it should be. I think it's a shame that it is, because the designation of a pastor as father is biblical. And it's very helpful because in some ways, although certainly pastor is also salutary and good, the designation of father is more organic. I mean, a shepherd is a shepherd when he's out in the field. You still can call him a shepherd when he's, home at night, but he's not as quite easily as recognizable as a shepherd. But a father is always a father. Whether he's with his family or not, he's always a father. I don't know, maybe that doesn't work, but it does for me anyway.
Well, I think you have a really good point there, because it is not as though we ever cast off our office as one in the office of the Holy Ministry. This is it not the reason why when we are ordained and then even subsequently installed at another place, we renew our promise to lead a holy life, that we would adorn this office with a holy life, because it is something that we bear, a yoke that we bear all the time. So I don't think you're off base at all, Fritz. I think if we are to consider for ourselves the best analogy by which to understand what God has called us to do, what better analogy for a householder than one who really runs the family economy now, which is the father?
Well, the image of father is, in a very simplistic way, the life giver. And the task of the pastor is to hand out the gifts of life to his children, who are born of water and the Spirit and the waters of holy baptism, to make sure they get to the table and have the food they need so they're nourished in life. The image is a very good one to bring forward. Not that you can't go back to using shepherd, but I think by having multiple images that tell us about this, it's very important. And to be reminded, I did like the reminder even here of the fact that that the office never is gone from you. So you get that language of Paul to Timothy about, the looking at the qualifications of the office. You might go through that and say, well, then we're pretty much all out of that. And yet we have to live by faith, and we repent of these things and our weaknesses in some of these things. At the same time, recognizing you can't live full time in, whether it's drunkenness or always being angry or whatever the case may be, because they aren't suitable for the work of a father over his family.
Yeah, that goes back to that father imagery. That there's no father on earth that does it the way he's supposed to. But there are some fathers who are disgusting in their behavior toward their family. There are others who, in spite of their weaknesses, are loved by their family. There's a range of propriety, you might say. And I think it's just an exaggerated way of looking at what we tell our people, namely that the difference between a Christian and a non-Christian is not the level of sinfulness, but the penitent heart. Because after all, our hearts are all stained with sin. We all have this original albatross that hangs around our neck. It's horrible. We're a bag of maggots, as Luther would say. We're all that. And so that's why we commit sins. That's why we think sinful things. That's why we say sinful things. It's true of every Christian. It's magnified the necessity of recognizing the importance of penitence, of a repentant heart in a pastor. And that leads, in a more magnified sense, also to faithfulness. I mean, a pastor is expected to pray more than the people do. A pastor is expected to like being in church, to put it real simply, more than the people do. In fact, the people expect him to. They ask him to pray for them. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. In fact, I like to chide pastors who chide people for asking the pastor to pray for them. I think that's a good and salutary thing. In fact, I've often said also that people who seek their pastor's blessing are doing a good and noble thing as well, because they expect their pastors to be a little better behaved, a little more faithful, a little more in tune with the will and word of God than they themselves are.
Now, I'd like to go back a little bit to this stewards of the mysteries of God. And Fritz, you already mentioned that the word mystery from the Vulgate is sacramenta. We would think of that as sacraments, but more generally, it's holy things. How does this understanding of a steward of the mysteries of God kind of harken back to what Melanchthon speaks about in the Apology with regard to the liturgy, that it is defining the pastor as a liturgical servant, right? One who is to be divvying out God's holy things in his stead and by his command. How does that phrase, the mysteries of God and the holy things of God, define us as liturgical beings, or as a liturgical office, not just as a hand-holding office?
Well, I'm going to go back to what I said a little bit ago. It's an honor, of course, but it's also, in another respect, terrifying. As the psalmist says in the 119th Psalm, I am afraid of thy judgments. I'm not just making this out of thin air. I like the old, it's not the old one, it's one of the Luther movies made about maybe 10, 15 years ago, where he's so terrified at his first celebration of Mass that he actually spills it. There's something about that I like. I haven't been able to actually nail it down yet, but I think we need more of that. The reverence that we have in the divine service is an outgrowth of fearing, loving, and trusting in God above all things. And it has to be exemplified in the pastor handling the mysteries of God and dealing in the mysteries of God. I love that word because it means there's something more there than what you see. And if you don't know that, then you're not living by faith. A long time ago, I had to deal with a grade school teacher. This was in a former life, perhaps, practically. It was so long ago. But I remember it vividly because the school teacher in question decided to take her children into the sacristy. These were like fourth graders. And just give them a taste of a communion host that was unconsecrated, just to kind of remove some of the mystery. And I found out about this, and I told her she shouldn't have done that. And I said, we don't want them to be stripped of the idea that this is a mystery. That's exactly what we don't want to do. So what you've done is kind of impinged on their sense of awe, which we should all have when we approach the holy things.
Well, it's that even like Ecclesiastes 5, where you enter into the gates, into the house of the Lord with fear and trembling. There is the sense of approaching the holy God, no matter what situation you're in there, when the mysteries are there. And part of that is even like the mystery of the God made flesh. The other references that you have in the New Testament. If you're proclaiming God made flesh, and the sacrament also is this incarnational reality, sacramental reality, however you want to describe it, it is this mystery you can't fully define, even as you can't define that Jesus is both God and man in one person. It changes your approach to being near those things. I mean, you're right to just sort of treat it as the ordinary, as just bread is almost a reformed notion. Let's all go taste the bread, rather than saying we use these things for the holy purpose of the sacrament. And here in the sacrament, the words of Jesus are clear that once the words are spoken, this is the body of Christ, no matter what it tastes like.
I have another illustration of fear and trembling that in fact is a very up to the minute type thing for me, because we have just entered the last phase of our renovation project here at St. Paul's. And in order to do that, we have to move our worship into the gym for several weeks. So we've set up a temporary altar in there and seating with folding chairs and so forth. And it's important yet difficult to achieve a sense of holiness in a place that you're not used to worshiping in. And I recall as I do these things that there were even canons in the early church against consecrating elements at an unconsecrated altar. I mean, I know we don't abide by the canons, but just to think of what our fathers would think of how we do things, in spite of the fact that sometimes necessity requires it, gives you a sense of pause. When you move around like this, even though you have to do it and you're doing it for the benefit of your worship experience, there's a sense of care or carefulness that we need to employ. I think of like when Solomon was building the temple, he ordered that all the noise be done somewhere else. I love that passage. The building of the making the stones and everything that was loud and noisy had to be done away from the site, the building site, and then brought to the site.
You mentioned, Fritz, that because we are stewards of God's mysteries, servants of Christ, that since that is primarily liturgical understanding, that this idea of fear and reverence
Does the lack of fear and reverence stem from not understanding that we are there in the stead and by the command of Christ? Or do they think that they are, but they have a different understanding of who Christ is and who the Father is?
Well, that's $1 million question. I'm not going to try to get into anyone's head.
Well,
but
yeah, I don't want you to psychologize.
Right. I mean, I don't know what they're thinking, but what I can do is say what it tells me. That kind of body language, that kind of approach says to me, we're not doing anything particularly holy or important or special. Mm. It's not different than what we would do in our own kitchen or living room. And I instinctively recoil, as I know God-fearing people do. There's something wrong with this. There's, one of our editors, Larry Bean, they're very good about putting stuff up on the blog about this kind of thing. It's sometimes you have to see it to believe it in a negative sense. Some of the outrageous things that are going on and accounted as worship. And you can't find a particular prohibition of it. It doesn't say anywhere in the Bible that you should not worship with cow manure all over your feet. But if you do, if you choose to bring the cow manure into the worship area, clearly there's something wrong with that. And I think that's, in a way, what Gottesdienst is all about, really. We have to find ways to verbalize this so that people understand what battles we're fighting.
Do you think that this, Karl, what Fritz is talking about, do you think this relates at all to our understanding of our own original sin and the sin that we have added thereafter?
I'd say that's probably part of it. I kind of backtrack a little bit when I think of when you're a young pastor, you have to learn when you come out of the American culture not to be embarrassed by your sense of holiness and portraying that sense of holiness, because we have this sort of, we're all equal pastor, don't put yourself up on the pedestal pastor, that kind of thing is playing in your head until you realize, as a steward of the mysteries of God, you're doing this. Now, in a culture where many people reject original sin, it's almost like God is your buddy sometimes. And this great level playing field means you all have God as the buddy, and you're all just kind of slapping each other on the back. And I'm getting exaggerated here. I do that at times. But it's sort of like there is no respect for the pastor. There's no idea the pastor should do that. As I point out, though, to my school children, my catechumens, and even other places, when I'm in church, I'm a much different person than I am, even in Bible class. And then if you get me outside of that, I'm another person as well. But before the altar of God, there's a sense that, yes, I am this sinner who has been given this office to proclaim Christ, and I should tread with some fear and trembling. The Luther, movie thing that Fritz was mentioning earlier. But even a few weeks ago, I'm up there, and all these years, nothing like this has happened. But before I had consecrated the host, I bumped into something, and you ended up with the host on the floor. Now, it was not yet the body of Christ, but even then, just the sort of guilt that came upon me, and the reality of these are the things to be used for the holy purpose. It just was overwhelming. I had to get down on the floor and pick them up, without being too rushed, and sort of that. And it was an unpleasant experience, even though I kept assuring myself, look, these things have not had the words spoken over them yet. But it did allow a chance for me to talk and teach at the end of the service why I treated them differently at that point than I would have once they were consecrated.
There's the famous story that a lot of listeners perhaps remember about the Luther conducting his last Mass, I think it was, in or near Eisleben, when he was so weak and shaking as he was distributing the elements that he was shaking, holding the chalice, and spilled on the floor. And at that moment, he stopped with the distribution, set the chalice on the altar, got down on his hands and knees and licked the holy species off the floor. And the part that gets me is that the whole congregation broke out in tears. I think that kind of approach to holy things is what we're after.
Right, that we are always cognizant of the fact that we are not there because there's anything special in us, but because rather we have been put into this office to be a servant at the behest of Christ and to be a steward of the holy things, the mysteries of God, which we can comprehend yet not fully. There's always more than meets the eye or any of our senses, more to be pondered, and that we are there because Christ has put us there for the benefit of his people. And if that is how, in the old translation, St. Paul said, this is how men should regard us, how much more should it be that we regard ourselves in that way, so that by considering those things, we thereby orient ourselves. See, I used one of your $1 million words, Fritz. We orient ourselves to towards the right place and towards the right duty.
Well, I'm thinking, I guess I'm thinking back on what you asked earlier by way of considering this, which is something you tempted me to think. And that is, do people who don't approach the matter this way have a different concept of God? I'm tempted to say that they do. And if I actually did say that, then I'd have to defend it, and I'm too lazy to try and defend it because I don't know what they're thinking, as I said.
Mm-hmm.
But certainly, if your God is just a buddy, if you don't need the forgiveness of sins from him, if you can get along fine with just having him slap you on the back and so forth, you're going to approach these things different. You don't really need the holy things. All you really need is some assurance that everything's okay, which is a far cry from needing the mercy of a God from whom you don't have reason other than the blood of Christ to expect it.
Yeah, it's like when the Augsburg Confession was presented, and we had a number of articles at the beginning where we said, these are the things that we agree with the Roman Church about. And then in the confutation, they find out, we don't really agree with them on these early things either. Original sin. It's similar, but there's a slight difference there. And, like in golf, if your club face is a little bit open at the point of contact or a little bit too closed at the point of contact, that makes a huge difference in where that ball ends up. And
well, that's why I don't have a good swing.
That's why you don't have a good swing. That's right. So in a similar vein, in theology, if you end up slightly misunderstanding original sin, or you slightly misunderstand what the fear of God is, then you end up with a completely different understanding of God, or of our place before him.
I think I would say it's more than anything maybe the Christology here, because I think of the Nestorians, and they liked to do things like break in on a group of Orthodox Christians celebrating the Blessed Supper and cast the holy things on the ground, because their argument, of course, was that since they didn't buy in fully to the incarnation, they could make this argument that they were against the sacrament that the Orthodox were celebrating too. They didn't take the sacrament in the same serious vein because of their position on the incarnation. And you see that again, even like the Calvinists and the days of the Reformation. I mean, a totally different attitude about these things. Now, I know the Calvinists were kind of rigid about things and stiff, but it was from a different standpoint. I think they did come more from the holy God aspect, and I'm not saying that's not a good thing to have, but I think it had to be even more the Christology involved.
Well, everything relates to Christology, as we all know. All theology is Christology.
Yeah, I've heard that somewhere.
Well, yeah, to misunderstand Christ is, either to sin on one side or the other. Either he's just man, or primarily man, and in that case, you don't really have to treat him with the kind of dignity you would treat God. Or he's just God and he's not really in and among us. It's kind of transcendent. The incarnation has to be called a mystery. And the two natures of Christ in the one person has to be affirmed. Because, as you pointed out so well, if it's a little off, if he's part one and part the other, or if he's a mixture or something, or there's a split. If you didn't really mean it when you said he's one person, if you think that you say Jesus is God, but you would never say that God died on the cross.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to have trouble.
Right.
That's why I love Luther's quotes about things. He extrapolates. He says stuff like, Mary made soup for God, toddled God on her knee. I love that kind of talk.
Well, just to go back to the key confessional moment in the Christological controversies, where you had to learn to confess Mary is the mother of God. If you couldn't say that, you ended up at the wrong point.
Right.
Yeah, that was not a confession about Mary as much as it was about Christ.
And as you've already said, all theology is Christology.
That's right.
Well, thanks for your time, guys. I appreciate this afternoon, you carving out an hour of your time so that we could get things sorted out internet-wise and then microphone-wise to bring this to the Gottesdienst crowd. Any final thoughts in terms of what this passage has to teach us, not primarily the people in our pews of how they should regard us, but how we should think of ourselves? Fritz, why don't you go first?
Well, I tend to think of things that happened in the past in my own experience. I remember years ago, I was at a conference or something, and I was walking, I think it was in Madison, and I was walking across the campus, not thinking anything of it, and there were some younger I was kind of young at the time myself, but there were some other pastors who were younger than I was, who were kind of shocked that I was walking around in my collar. And I was really kind of surprised by that. Well, why shouldn't I? I'm a pastor. It's what pastors wear. And I think that the first thing that a pastor needs to learn, we haven't quite covered this yet, so I'll use this last shot as an opportunity. First thing that a pastor needs to learn is to be comfortable with his own office and authority. Because if he's not comfortable with it, it's going to be awkward, and he's going to be saying and doing things and behaving in ways that he really shouldn't, as is the case in any kind of failure to be comfortable with what you're doing. That's especially true of the office of the ministry. You need to be comfortable with what you've been given.
How about you, Karl?
I don't know. I'm thinking at this point of just even the way Jesus has the various parables, the one in which in particular you get the language of where he entrusts, the coins to the three different ones, and the first two use them well, and the third one buries it. And the thing about the pastor's office of being the steward in the household is you always take the gifts you've given and keep handing them out. And sometimes, unfortunately, you learn, as old pastors like me learn, that the gifts seemed to almost be wasted. And yet, then again, you hand out those gifts and you have these very faithful people who grow up in the faith. And so it is a sort of, when you're dealing with the mysteries of God, it's also a mystery in your own office of how any of these things work at times. And yet it's all by giving out the incarnate Christ and his gifts to the church that these things happen. And so you are this ambassador, or to go back to your reference to the liturgy and that whole section from the Apology, where he goes into that definition and makes it an official act of someone in the court, or a public act. Certainly this is something that has to be borne out when you say you are the servants of Christ. This is not the servants of other places. This is a servant in which you are the ambassador. And I wish we'd go back to that older translation.
Yeah, servant is too easily co-opted into all the servant leadership kind of nonsense that is prevalent today.
Well, and then everybody's a servant,
Right.
Which I know is a totally different issue.
Well, thanks again, guys. This was a really helpful conversation for distilling that chapter of 1 Corinthians and how we should regard ourselves in terms of being a servant in Christ's stead and by his command, doling out as his stewards the holy things, the mysteries of God, and that we can only give what we have first received, so that we also have to be on the receiving end of those things. Very helpful for you guys to point all of this out for us. So remember, guys, you pastors out there, that first and foremost, you are a ambassador of Christ, his representative in the flesh, to give out what he has accomplished and given you to give out. And that is the source of not only your authority, but also of your comfort as you serve in his stead and by his command. So thanks for your time, guys, and look forward to having you guys on again.